Thank you for listening to this presentation about using a theory of change approach. My name is Dominique Lowenthal and I'm Head of Professional Development at the RCSLT. We started using this approach in 2012 and have found it to be helpful for a number of projects. So much so that many of you have asked for a practical presentation like this one that you can access whenever you need to. Before we get started, it might be worth noting that some people call it a journey of change and that there are other similar models available as well, but fundamentally they follow the same core principles. This presentation is accompanied by audio, but we have tried to make the screens easy to follow even if you don't have audio switched on. So, you've got lots of great ideas, but you're not sure how to order them. Whenever I think about outcome measures and theories of change and trying to explain the complexities involved in how what you do every day has a long-term impact on those people that you're working with, it can feel quite tangled and quite confusing. So some of the terms that you'll hear in the world of outcome measures and activities are what the service is delivering at every level: universal, specialist and targeted. Outputs is the numbers. For example, how many assessments are being done, how many staff are being trained, what are the number of therapy goals achieved. Interim outcomes are what have we enabled others to do towards achieving those ultimate outcomes. For example, an activity, now you can say that people have got improved language skills, they've got increased socialisation with peers, improved understanding, skills and confidence in the wider workforce and families. So those might be some examples of things that would be in your interim outcome column. Now, indicators, these are things that you would use to measure the evidence of progress towards those interim outcomes. These might be quality measures like the number and percentage of children who are now able to enter school ready to learn and pre and post screens. That's the evidence that describes that the theory of change isn't just a theory. It actually is a model of change that is working and is happening, but it might also help you identify where you don't have evidence and you don't have data that perhaps you should be looking for or should be collecting. Now, the ultimate outcomes, how we're describing them today is we're thinking about long-term policy outcomes. So that might be the NHS outcomes framework or the Children and Young People's strategy, 10-year strategy which is used in Northern Ireland. These are the ultimate outcomes as described at a policy level. And usually they're population based. So taking dementia, there was the Prime Minister's challenge on dementia. You could look at those as some examples around ultimate outcomes. However, if you were creating a theory of change that was more local, your ultimate outcome might be more service-based and more defined by your local commissioner, and that's absolutely fine. How do you explain to others the value of what you do in a simple way that they can understand and means that you're not talking cross purposes? And this is where a theory of change may be able to help. In this presentation, we're going to cover what a theory of change is, how it can help with outcomes, how to practically build a theory of change, and how we're using it at the RCSLT with a few examples. So what is a theory of change? I think the first thing I want to say is not to be alarmed or worried about the wording of theory of change. Some people have said to me that it sounds a little bit daunting because it sounds theoretical. Theories of change have been around for some time now, since the 1990s, and the key thing about them is that they're outcomes based. They're based on what is the final result that you're looking to achieve, and theories of change have been built for projects, for all different kinds of initiatives, simple ones and complex ones, and it's a causal model. It describes how A leads to B leads to C, and it helps to articulate some of those underlying assumptions, but in an easy to follow story of why what you do matters. So theory of change is basically, it's a methodology for planning and for participation and evaluation of a project or work that you're doing to bring about change. It's been used by charities, governments and not-for-profits. And a completed theory of change, like I said, is a causal map of your project. It just shows how different things, different stages of the work that you do relate to other stages. And it's like a map. It just shows the links between what you do and how those feed into bigger outcomes. Can you show me simply? This is often a frequent question. Well, with a theory of change, you need to slot in the activities that you do with the interim outcomes and link those to the ultimate outcomes. It might seem counterintuitive, but a good way to start with a theory of change is actually with the ultimate outcomes. What are the things that you're ultimately trying to achieve? And then what are the things which, the interim things, which help to bring about those ultimate things? And in a moment I'll give you some practical examples as well, so you'll see what I mean. And what this helps to do is to create a picture of how various activities influence the interim outcomes and how collectively those interim outcomes support the ultimate outcomes. So what if you don't know your ultimate outcomes yet? Don't worry. You can begin with what you do know first. For example, if you find it easier, you can just start with the activities that you do day to day and then ask yourself, well, why do I do those activities? And that will probably generate your first list of interim outcomes. Ask yourself again, well, why do those interim outcomes matter? And you'll start to populate outcomes that you can put into the interim outcome column and outcomes that you can put into the ultimate outcomes column. This is supposed to be simplistic. It's supposed to be an overall narrative picture of what you do. Please don't worry about perfecting it. A helpful tip is that the ultimate outcomes tend to be longer term and the interim outcomes tend to be shorter term. So what is different about theory of change? Well, theories of change, they provide an overview that explains how a desired change is expected to come about. There are other models and they tend to be, you might have heard of logic models, for example. They tend to have more detail. And of course there are numerous business models which help you calculate the number or units of resources, inputs and outputs required to achieve various outcomes, and actually some of these are very clever and will help produce a kind of value for money return on investment figure. But for the purposes of what we're doing today, we're trying to get a consensus and also to illustrate at a high level the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. More detailed models would sit underneath the theory of change that we're looking at making today. So I've talked a little bit about outcomes already. So how can theory of change help with outcomes? Well, a theory of change is a technique to think carefully about how the services deliver client outcomes, how these link to high-level policy outcomes, or sort of the most woollier long-term outcomes, and what our assumptions are for getting there. Not just our assumptions, but also what is the evidence. How can we evaluate our theory of change? The first step is in creating a theory of change, and once you have one, a model, then it's much easier to actually analyse what are the measures that we need to put in place to know that we are actually achieving these outcomes. So in summary, the theory of change can be used as a framework for turning data into action. How much did we do? How well did we do it? And is anybody better off? And it's also worth noting that there are other approaches, like I mentioned earlier, that use theory of change methodology. You may have heard it referred to as outcomes-based accountability or results-based accountability, or you might have heard of drivers' diagrams. All of these things, like I said, use similar principles. Okay, so I think it's time for a quiz. Can you correctly match these statements with the right terms? Please pause the video while you give this a few moments thought. Okay, how did you get on? Delivering training to staff in care homes on safe eating and swallowing practice is an activity. A percentage increase in practitioners using safe swallowing strategies in their setting is an indicator. Treating and caring for people in a safe environment and protecting them from avoidable harm is an ultimate outcome. The number of care homes receiving safe swallowing training is an output. And residents experiencing fewer problems with eating, drinking and swallowing is an interim outcome. How did you do? Don't worry if you didn't quite get them or you're very confused at the moment. Like I said, we're going to go through some practical examples which hopefully will clear things up. Quiz number 2. Can you correctly match these statements with the right terms? Again, please take a moment. How did you do? So, children are enjoying learning and achieving. This is an ultimate outcome. Targeted language group intervention is an activity. Percentage increase in language skills pre and post screen, before and after intervention is an indicator. Children have improved language skills is an interim outcome. And the number of children attending language group is an output. Okay, so down to business, how to build your own theory of change. You need the following elements: ultimate outcomes, interim outcomes, and activities. You notice I read those right to left. So I think it helps to start with the ultimate outcomes. What is the ultimate end achievement? How broad or specific these are will depend on who you are developing the theory of change for. The interim outcomes, because of X activity, Y happens. Often these are enabling outcomes, and it helps to start with a person. So staff are able to conduct a screen, service users, and these are all the things which as a result of your intervention or your support, service users are now better able to do. And the same for carers, families, parents, and any other people that your work impacts on. And then activities. What are the things that you or your service does? Now, the activities column, you can either be incredibly specific and list all the different detailed types of interventions you do, but I'd recommend you didn't do that. I'd recommend you grouped them into things that you're doing at a more universal level, things more a specialist, and things that are more targeted. So you might want to very simply just put here promotional and awareness raising work that you do, training activities, and particular specific assessments and interventions at a very high level that you do, not the detail at this point. The aim will be to try and get your theory of change onto no more than at least an A3 sheet. So we're going to build an example theory of change over the next few slides. We found it helpful to start from the ultimate outcomes and work backwards. However, you can start with activities or interim outcomes first if you prefer. Like I said, if you start with the activities, just make sure you think about what the activity has enabled others to do, how we prove that, and which national level outcomes this makes a contribution to. So step 1, identify your ultimate outcomes. These may be linked to government policies. So for example, in Northern Ireland, the Children and Young People's Plan gives these as ultimate outcomes. In England, the NHS Outcomes Framework gives these as ultimate outcomes. In Scotland, Getting It Right for Every Child 2012 gives these as ultimate outcomes. And in Wales, the Health and Care Standards 2015 give these as ultimate outcomes. Interestingly, you might start to notice some similarities, and often that's because although the terminology might be slightly different, the ambitions across the UK at a policy level, government level, tend to be similar, around independent living, around reducing hospital stays, enabling better participation in society, etc. So whatever the actual words, you'll see there is quite a lot of similarity. Let's roll up our sleeves and start building our first theory of change. Taking the example from Northern Ireland of the Children and Young People's Plan 2006 to 2016, if we start with the ultimate outcomes, you'll see that we have healthy, enjoying learning and achieving, living in safety and with stability, contributing positively to community and society, and living in a society which respects their rights. So once you have your ultimate outcomes written down, the next step is to say, how specifically do speech-language communication services contribute to these outcomes? And you can start to generate a list of interim outcomes. Well, the wider workforce is equipped to recognise a child with developmental delay. There's supported communication in place in the environment at home. There's increased participation with peers. The next question is, what kinds of activity lead to achieving these interim outcomes? And this is where you can write your list of activities. So as a service, we provide resources and training for screening. We provide parent workshops and training, and we do speech sound assessment and intervention. Once you have your basic map for your theory of change, then you can start to use it as an evaluation framework and start to think about, well, what is the evidence? What are the indicators that I can get hold of to prove your assertions? So, for example, what percentage of parents report reading more to the child? Is there an increased identification and appropriate referral of children? These are the kinds of things and indicators that you might use to provide evidence for your theory of change. Now, there's also, don't forget, very importantly, the evidence base. So there might not be local data that you can get hold of, but there should be an existing evidence base to support your assumption for why a particular intervention you're doing, you expect it to have a particular interim outcome. What you may find is that there isn't as much evidence in the evidence base as you would like. However, for the purposes of theory of change, you want to try and pull together any evidence or data or indicators that you can get hold of to support your theory of change and identify where the real gaps are. If you find that there's something really core to the work that you do and there isn't a lot of evidence to support it, this is when you need to be reaching out to your colleagues in the profession and also to the RCSLT, asking for, do we know of any other research that is available? Is there a project or any work that we can support more widely that would help to build the evidence base in this area? Okay, so the next step, test what you've drafted. So you've got the main elements of your theory of change drafted, and now you need to assess the strength and weakness of your evidence to support each interim outcome. So how strong is the evidence? What gaps in the evidence base have you identified? And what local data from your patch or a patch similar to yours do you have access to? And depending on whose outcome that you're looking to find evidence for, what other types of evidence can you use? And then you can start to think about how you're going to fill in the gaps. So who can help you address those gaps? Don't forget to use the breadth of knowledge and skills in the whole of the SLT professional community, both nationally and locally. There are clinical excellence networks, SENS, there's obviously the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, there are local universities, and we also have research champions across the UK who might be able to help you find the evidence. But we have got a wonderful RCST research centre, which colleagues have been working tirelessly really to pull together all of the best links to research databases and information around research. I strongly recommend that you check it out. There's evidence in the evidence base, but also at a local level, your commissioners and yourselves will probably want to know what evidence, what data can we get hold of that actually shows that we are making a difference right here in our area with our clients. They came up, speech language therapists working in the justice sector generated this list of measures they might be able to use and where that information could be found. As a rule of thumb, don't start collecting new data if you can find data that other people are already collecting that is useful to you. So in the justice sector, they thought that reductions in risk assessment scores would be a good place to look to show the impact of speech and language therapy intervention, and that source would be in the ASSET tool or on the YOAS database. Now I'd like to go through another example, but this time taking an example for theory of change for achieving potential in a school. Okay, so if we look at the ultimate outcomes first, in a school environment, we're looking at ultimate outcomes which are about developing friendships, relationships and community inclusion, accomplishing goals and thereby boosting skills, confidence and self-esteem, and for the children being all that they can be, and also to improve health, well-being and access to healthcare. The interim outcomes were increased social inclusion of pupils, staff having an understanding of how to support speech-language communication needs and using appropriate interaction strategies, staff confident and able to adapt curriculum delivery, and accurate identification of children at risk of speech-language communication needs. And the kinds of activities happening in the school environment, obviously evidence-based one-to-one and group interventions, providing advice for communication-friendly classrooms, adapting resources for speech-language communication needs, and training on typical language development for staff and parents. So thinking about the indicators, the kind of data that might be available in a school would be the percentage of appropriate referrals, percentage of classrooms delivering a differentiated curriculum or meeting communication supporting environment criteria. Okay, and here's another example, this time taking an adult perspective in a dysphagia setting. To have fewer problems eating, drinking and swallowing, to have fewer chest infections, and to be less anxious or depressed. The types of activities are at universal level, training to all care homes on safe eating and swallowing practice, training staff to be feeding champions, to support individuals with more complex swallowing difficulties, and at specialist level assessment and advice for complex patients. Here the kind of indicators might be percentage of